Good morning. We made it to April 25th, and there's a lot that's happened and a lot that's going to happen in the next couple of weeks. So we're going to get you all prepared to know what Congress is doing and then give you a few updates on what's been happening in some of our federal agencies that touch people with disabilities. First, a little bit of candy on the front end because we should celebrate all of the work that people have been doing. Um, the state bill that was going to make changes to Medicaid eligibility, because so many people showed up to that hearing and delivered so many powerful statements, that has been a moment that has continued to get coverage far after the hearing. So this was a recent article that was published in the Racine Journal Times, and it's really worth reading. It's a very long piece, and the news hook was the state bill that had a hearing about Medicaid eligibility, but the story went a lot farther beyond that, and it really focused and spotlighted a family who talked about how hard it is right now for people to navigate Medicaid and the different requirements that programs require of families. And it went a lot farther than just what the bill was about. It really talked about and gave a good slice of life on, what happens if people have to do more to keep or stay in their Medicaid coverage, and also what happens if something goes wrong and you lose or get delayed a little bit. So it's really worth reading because it kind of draws a very clear line between here's what this bill would have done at the state level and why that would make everything harder and more expensive, and how many people lost coverage due to paperwork mistakes after the pandemic when everybody had to get renewed. There was a lot of new state data. The reporter had done a lot of work. But it also drew a real line between here are these ideas at the state level, and there's movement at the federal level with some of the same ideas. And the risks that we heard so much about in the state bill are the same risks if the federal government does something similar. Also this week, there is a fiscal estimate that state agencies are required whenever there's a state legislative bill that comes out. They have to think about what are the changes that bill makes, and does it result in an increased cost to the state agency? And so most bills that have some sort of impact, either you need to have more money to run a program or change a system, or you may need more people to do extra work. Most bills that have changes that might result in one of those things end up with fiscal notes that are written by state agencies, and they're kind of like estimates of if this bill were to become law, what would change and how much do we think it would cost our agency. It's kind of similar in the sense to what the federal government does when they're trying to project cost savings, right? We've heard a lot about what the Congressional Budget Office thinks a certain idea, like Medicaid work requirements, for example, would save the federal government in terms of reduced spending. This is the same type of idea, except it really calculates how much more it would cost if the change went into place. So the bill that would have required at twice as much work to make sure that people are doing eligibility checks twice a year instead of once. We now know what our Department of Health Services thinks that would cost. They think that doing that same work twice instead of once would cost Wisconsin taxpayers more than $60 million per year, every year. Plus, they'd need another $2.5 million to modify the technology systems that need to be working in order to process all of that work. And they would need 119 more people to do that work if you were serious about doing those checks with fidelity and making sure there weren't delays or other things administratively on the state's part that would cause people to lose coverage. So that's a really good window into, as we're thinking about what changes will mean for Wisconsin, some of what that might mean is extra costs that the state doesn't have now that they might have if changes go into place. So it's a good question, because there might be people who say, I'm kind of okay with us checking once a year and making sure that everybody who is in Medicaid is supposed to be there, because we already do that really well, and there isn't really people in Medicaid who aren't supposed to be there, instead of paying another $60 million every year to find out the same thing, for example. We also had a statewide editorial piece from the Wisconsin State Journal this week that noted that Medicaid is a Wisconsin issue, and frankly said that they thought Wisconsin's congressional Republicans needed to be very clear and work to make sure people in Wisconsin weren't losing Medicaid coverage. The article really focused on Representative Van Orden's district, but it did note, who had been meeting or hadn't made public statements about protecting Medicaid. It noted there was a letter, which we will cover a little bit later, that some congressional Republicans signed on to, at least giving a gesture that they didn't support benefit cuts to Medicaid, and that none of our Republican delegation had signed on. So it was a pretty clear statement from the statewide paper that this is a big issue for the state, and the state really should expect that our congressional delegation is working to guard the state's interest in preserving Medicaid as it's doing its work in Congress. We also had a number of events in multiple media districts this past couple of weeks, both by U.S. Senator Baldwin and Representative Moore, that were really focused on Medicaid and got a lot of different coverage in different media markets. So there was a lot of activity that was happening that was gaining press coverage as we had this 2-week recess. And some of you organized your own events and that were pretty successful and got coverage. Here's an example of one. There was a nice forum in Waukesha, and people used the hand raising method that we talked about last week. It turned out to be a great visual, and that was one of the things that ended up in the article, is that the reporter noticed that when they went through the questions and people were raising their hands about, hey, do you know somebody who's touched in Medicaid, that every hand in the room was raised. And that ended up being a statement in the article that I think made a pretty powerful impression to the reporters who were there covering it. You'll also notice that they covered more than just Medicaid, some of the other larger disability issues that are happening at the federal level. And the article also noticed that they collected written and video testimonies that this group is now going to be delivering to lawmakers. So again, they organized an event, they got people there, they generated stories that will be used later on, and they got press coverage in a major media market on it. So what is Congress doing right now, or what are they planning to do? Because we've had this kind of 2-week recess period, and we've talked in previous webinars about how the committees in the U.S. House of Representatives that were assigned cuts have been using this 2-week period to kind of write the bill language and figure out what things they want to cut. Well, now the 2-week recess is over, so we should be prepared that we're going to have to ramp up activity, because Congress is getting ready to reveal what ideas that they have for cuts by committee. So we're now moving into the period where the House is going to be actively, revealing the cuts that each committee is planned to make, as well as spending increases, because there are some committees that have been assigned the ability to make increases. And those committees will be having what are called budget markup meetings, which are basically public meetings where all the language that they've been drafting kind of behind closed doors becomes public. And we will start to see what are the actual details, what are the actual proposals on what they plan to cut and how. The House is planning to try and move fairly quickly. So they are now trying to get all of their committee work done in the next couple of weeks so that they can potentially have a floor vote with the whole House of Representatives voting on a one big bill that has all the cuts from all the committees in it as soon as May 19th. There's always a little bit of play in these deadlines. That's certainly what the speaker is saying. This is what I want to happen. But as you know, he said he wanted this bill to be done by end of February, and we have successfully created enough reason to slow things down that we're now in mid-May and we're kind of still on the front end of the process. So these deadlines may be, if something doesn't come out on an exact day that has been said, it's not that it's not coming, it's that there's been a delay, and there's probably a delay because somebody is concerned about a cut or something they're hearing from a constituent. And that's good news for us, the longer there's a delay. So a little more specific timeline. Starting next week, as soon as April 30th, we are going to start seeing committees have markup sessions and revealing the language that they want to put into the big all-encompassing reconciliation bill. There are 3 committees that have spending increases. The Department of Defense, that's DoD, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Justice. Most of those increases are intended to facilitate immigration enforcement and other criminal enforcement activities with DOJ. So one note, and I now have to change my slide, is that the upper for the Department of Defense has changed to be higher than 100 billion. It is now, the House has agreed to raise that committee spending by 150 billion, which raises the question, if you're adding more money to spending in one committee, does that mean that you're looking for more cuts elsewhere to offset that spending increase? I think the answer is yes. That if you're adding to how much you're spending, especially in the House of Representatives, there are certainly many fiscal conservatives who would say, well, if you're adding spending here, that means you have to take it away from somewhere else. As soon as April 30th, which is next week, Wednesday, we might see the Transportation and Financial Services Committees, which have some smaller amounts of cuts, but still significant, go and say what they want to do. And then the majority of committees, their plans might come out between the 5th and the 8th of May, including the Energy and Commerce Committee. We're hearing May 7th is the current goal deadline. There was a rumor a couple of days ago that that committee was less settled on what it wanted to do and could be as late as the week of May 12th. But I think it's useful to just plan that most committees that have cuts important to people with disabilities might come out not next week, but the week after. The May 9th is a non-binding deadline. That is the hope that all committees would have their kind of initial work, identify the cuts they want to make done by that date. Certainly if the House Speaker is correct on his timing, that will not be a problem for most committees to make that deadline. And then the all-important Ways and Means Committee will have its budget markup on the week of the May 12th, which puts us in line for potentially 3 weeks from now on the 19th, the full House being ready to vote on the reconciliation bill. There is a recess that is going to come at potentially after that bill has been passed. And then if the reconciliation bill, if and when the reconciliation bill is passed, remember that the Senate has to do all of the same work, and that language has to agree on both the House and the Senate before you have a bill that can be signed by the president. The Senate is already saying we're not going to get to this until mid-June. That's what they're currently saying now. So I want people to understand that we have some intense time where we're going to have to be very, very vigilant and responsive to all of these different ideas that are coming out, but it doesn't mean anything is over, even after the House has passed a bill. We still have a lot of time to influence what ends up in that bill and what gets taken out. There's still a lot of debate about Medicaid in particular. And we've kind of covered that there are many Republican legislators who understand that Medicaid is pretty popular with their constituents and needed by their constituents. So there is a group of Republican lawmakers who's extremely worried about cuts to Medicaid in particular, because they think that people back home will really notice those cuts, and it would be hard for them to explain away, things that their constituents are using and need. There's a lot of rumor about what may or may not be proposed as part of Medicaid cuts. I think the national folks are still operating like there is a wide group of ideas that is being considered. And certainly from day to day, we hear different things. Couple of things to highlight. We keep hearing about work requirements as being an idea that's been repeated consistently over time. One thing to note is the amount of money the Congressional Budget Office says will be saved by work requirements, which really is, this is how many people will lose their coverage, so we won't have to spend money for them, is I think the calculation. That estimate of how much work requirements would save the federal government keeps increasing. In February, they calculated it would be $120 billion in savings over 10 years. Now it's at $200 billion. You can make you could wonder if that's just, are they inflating that estimate? Like, are they being more generous with it? Or, as many advocates suspect, are they changing the parameters of who falls into work requirements so it covers as many people as possible with as few exemptions as possible, so that there are more people who run the risk of not completing that administrative process correctly and potentially losing or delaying their coverage. I actually think that second scenario is more likely, that the estimate has increased because the work requirements are going to apply to more people. But we're going to see very shortly, when the committee reveals what it's doing, what those requirements are. The other thing that we haven't talked about a lot before, there is a new estimate on how much would we save if we did more frequent Medicaid eligibility checks. That's exactly the topic of the state bill that we just had a hearing on a few weeks ago. Same idea at the congressional level. This was not on their original menu of things that they were considering, but it falls into the kind of big bucket of what are the administrative things that you can do that make it harder for people to get in Medicaid or stay in Medicaid. And you can see that now there is an estimate of, well, we could save $170 billion by doing more Medicaid eligibility checks. Interestingly, we know that a lot of the state Medicaid directors have really said very clearly, like, this is not the place where there's any fraud and abuse. Like, we do a good job of checking and making sure people in Medicaid are eligible to be there. So that $170 billion in savings is probably coming not because we are maybe removing people from the Medicaid rolls who should never have been there in the first place, but because people who are qualified are losing coverage. There's also been a lot of consistent talk over time about provider taxes, which impacts this state a little less than many others, being changed, and lowering the match for Medicaid expansion populations. Honestly, there's so much impact from all of these decisions that there could be other changes that aren't mentioned either in this article or aren't being talked about publicly that end up in the committee's recommendations, only because, sometimes there are states that say, hey, if you do this, it really impacts us a lot. And sometimes lawmakers like to try and make a bunch of changes so the impact is spread across states pretty equally. So for a state like Wisconsin, which has not yet expanded Medicaid, reducing the amount of federal match for the Medicaid expansion population doesn't impact us as much, but it does impact 40 other states a lot. And so the balance of, do we only impact those 40 states, or do we make some other changes that also, apply to all states or states that haven't expanded Medicaid specifically? I feel like those are all on the table, and we're going to find out very quickly how the committee is planning to balance out, harm essentially that is going to happen to all states. I mentioned the letter. This is the letter that the Wisconsin State Journal was referencing. On April 16th, there were 12 described vulnerable from a voter perspective. Like, is it likely that they could lose their seat if voters didn't like what they did, right? Vulnerable or moderate House Republicans, 12 of them signed onto a letter and that said they wouldn't support Medicaid cuts that would lead to, quote, reduction in Medicaid coverage for vulnerable populations. Now, last week we talked a lot about, kind of the language that sounds okay, but doesn't necessarily actually mean protection. I think this is a meaningful gesture in the sense that we had 12 moderate Republicans who had heard enough from potential voters in their districts where they realized that Medicaid is a big issue for those voters, and they want to show them in some way that they have heard them. Now, none of Wisconsin's Republican delegations signed on to this letter. And it's important to know that the letter doesn't define who's vulnerable. And we had that conversation last week of, when you don't define who is part of that category, you really are not protecting, and you're not specifically protecting anybody. There certainly are people who we might think would fall under the category of vulnerable that may not, under whatever definition lawmakers actually put into their legislative language. So it is worth noting that while the gesture is there, there's no specific, like, all of these people. It does not say anybody who's currently covered in these programs is completely safe. They're not making that guarantee. The letter is also really silent on changes that make it harder, like increased Medicaid eligibility checks or work requirements, two things that have been talked about pretty consistently that result in people missing administrative steps and losing their coverage. It doesn't say that they are opposed to those kinds of things that make it harder for people to get or stay in Medicaid. So it only says that we don't want any reduction in coverage for vulnerable people. It doesn't say they don't want it, that the coverage might not be harder to get. And it doesn't necessarily say, who, if they oppose fewer people getting in. It just says whomever we think is vulnerable, we think they should get the same coverage, not lose benefits. Of course, if you lose eligibility, you're not in the program and you've lost everything. So just parsing that out. Also this week, there was a shifting in messaging from House Republicans that they've shifted away from the idea that we're not cutting Medicaid, or we're not, nobody's going to lose benefits. Those have been two lines that many people have heard over the last few weeks, really. And I think this may be a sign that enough people have been contacting offices saying, I'm not sure I trust that that's true, or noting that there's no way that you can prevent harm with the scale of cuts that you're doing. Now the messaging seems to be very different. Again, pointing the blame more at states, saying, oh, well, nobody's going to be cut off from Medicaid as long as governors decide they want to continue to fund the program. And that's really a shift of blame to states that's, I think our state lawmakers would find not real welcome, right? Because you're making huge cuts at the federal level, and then big pieces of the state's budget are Medicaid, and even small cuts can mean big state budget holes, and states only have 4 options. They either have to pay a lot more to provide the same coverage, and we've had several articles that really demonstrate that that isn't going to be reality for states, that the amount of money, the amount of harm federal cuts will have will not be something that states have another pot of money to just fill in, right? So if you can't spend more to keep Medicaid the same as it is now, then you really are forced with having to change who can get in or can't to the program, what it covers, benefits, or how much people are paid to deliver those services. And I think this is a shift that, again, is trying to allow federal lawmakers to claim, well, it's the state's decision how they want to handle those cuts. So if something happens to your benefits, then you should blame, those people at your state level who made the actual cuts, instead of us who cut the funding at the federal level that caused states to have to do those things. So what committees are we going to be watching in the next few weeks? I'll start with the Ways and Means Committee. This has a big, one of the committees that has a big spending increase. And the reason it has a big spending increase is because this is where all of the costs of extending the 2017 tax cuts is housed. So, it's going to be reflected as greater spending here if you're dealing with the taxes in this committee. The important piece of this committee is less about the amount of tax cuts that are packed in. This committee also covers eligibility and programs that provide health payments for health care and healthcare delivery systems. So that this would be where you might see changes to that could affect different healthcare systems, including Medicare and Medicaid. It's also a place where public assistance and eligibility provisions for lots of different programs are housed. This is the committee that thinks about that stuff. So if they change and tweak, who can get into certain kinds of programs, maybe you have to earn, less to qualify, for example, this is probably where you would find those kinds of changes. And people are noting that if you make changes to eligibility or payments to healthcare systems that could result in savings, that could be reflected as essentially a spending cut again, which would enable the committee to cut taxes more. And remember that originally when we started the reconciliation process, we were only talking about extending the current 2017 tax cuts. Since that time in March, the president has had a number of ideas about ways to reduce revenue. a couple of ideas on not taxing Social Security income and not taxing on tips and several other ideas that would impact revenue. So if Congress wants to try and figure out a way to also include those ideas in this reconciliation bill, it means they have to find even more savings to offset the revenue that would no longer be coming in. And some people are thinking that this committee may try and figure out ways to do that, so that they can, accommodate more of the tax cuts that beyond the 2017 tax cuts that the president has indicated he supports. So the Agriculture Committee, what we're going to be watching for here, this is the committee that covers the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, which is food share in Wisconsin. It's been pretty consistent over time that people are expecting there might be cuts to that program, meaning less money sent to states for food share recipients. That doesn't necessarily impact the state money or the state budget, because the SNAP assistance is truly all federal money that comes to the states. However, we're also watching for, are they going to be changing work requirements for the SNAP program that exists and making it either apply to more people or making states do things that they don't have to do now. And that might make fewer people eligible. So again, we'll see what the details are in the committee, but those are two things that are in the Agriculture Committee that could impact people with disabilities and older adults significantly, because many folks who qualify for Medicaid are also automatically qualified for SNAP. And in fact, our Department of Health Services kind of links those two systems together, so you don't have to apply for both separately, which is a big deal. The Education and Workforce Committee, some of the things that are included in this committee, we've been talking about some of the big cuts to the Department of Education. They've cut 46% of their staff. So there's some speculation of, are you going to, codify is the right word. I'm trying to think of a simpler word. Are you going to say, oh, the cuts that have already happened in the department through the kind of non-governmental DOGE committee, are we going to include that as cuts that in savings in this reconciliation bill? That's certainly possible. This is the place where the IDEA money that flows to states, because there is a significant amount of federal money that the U.S. Department of Education does distribute to states, specifically for students with disabilities. That's where this is. DVR and other programs funded under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act are here. And also some civil rights enforcement, including enforcement for ADA, is in this committee. So there's quite a bit of things that we want to watch for in this committee that could impact states and people with disabilities. The Energy and Commerce Committee is where Medicaid is housed. We've spent a lot of our discussion over the last, I don't know how many weeks, 12, 14, 16, on this particular committee. And this is the committee that has been asked to cut the most. It's been asked to cut $880 billion. And most people say most of that most of those cuts are going to have to come from Medicaid. The committee covers more than just Medicaid. It covers the Affordable Care Act, Medicare, Medicaid, and CHIP, as well as some other things that have a footprint for people with disabilities. But again, most people are expecting that the majority of cuts are going to come from Medicaid. In the last week, this committee also does some work with telecommunications. There's been some speculation they may do some other things that make it like reduce the amount of cuts to Medicaid, but from 880 billion to something like 600 billion. So still, no matter what, there's still big cuts to Medicaid that would be contained in this committee. Few other committees, transportation and infrastructure, which is likely to be one of the committees that goes first. At least $10 billion there. That's where the transit funding is. So if you're a non-driver, and use either county-based programs for rides, some of that money is coming through federally, or if you're using a bus system, that is a place to watch for whether there will be cuts there. The Financial Services Committee is where public housing is. So again, a place to watch there. And the other important piece is when we're throwing all these numbers about, 880 billion or 10 billion or whatever, those are all you must cut at least. So committees certainly can't cut less than those numbers, but they can cut more. And again, with wanting to spend more on the Department of Defense and wanting to spend or to figure out a way to do additional taxes that weren't part of the original plan, there may be some committees who are looking for extra cutting to offset some of that increased spending. So in the next 2 weeks, it's going to be important that we react and respond to anything and everything that we think is going to impact people with disabilities negatively, or you negatively yourself. And that's going to be a lot. Like, there are going to be committees that come out with things, and we're going to try and give you an analysis of what the committee's cuts are. And then people are going to have to decide whether those cuts impact them, and quickly contact their members of Congress to tell them about why those things are impactful to them. You're going to have to call, you're going to have to email. We have a new strategy we'll talk about writing personal letters, and you should expect to have to do that multiple times about multiple things. At this point, there's zero disadvantage. There's only advantage to saying no to things that you don't think are helpful as loudly as possible. That is the only way that Congress is going to get a message through that there's a cut that they've proposed that people are watching and that they don't like, and that Congress should maybe reconsider or do something differently. We absolutely have the ability to prevent cuts from being included, and we have the ability to convince lawmakers to remove cuts or change the ideas that they have proposed. So, but it all relies on people really watching and then following through and taking some action to make sure that people know what things are in the proposed cuts that they don't like and how it would impact them. The other important reason to be very loud, and I would say you should contact your U.S. senators as well, not just your U.S. representative, even when it's only in the House. The Senate is going to also be seeing what the House is proposing at the same time all of us are. And they're going to be watching. They're going to be watching to see how people react to the ideas that the House is proposing. They are kind of sitting back and seeing what gets real opposition and what cuts nobody seems to be saying as much about. And that's giving the Senate information, because the Senate can choose to do a very different bill. The Senate kind of gave itself some more flexibility in the instructions it gave its committees. So if they see something that people are really objecting to that's in the House plan, the Senate can write a very different idea or not include that idea at all in their plan. And that's important, because the more different what the Senate says it wants to do and what the House says it wants to do, the more different those plans are, the more likely that those cut ideas will change. Because remember, the Senate and the House have to agree exactly for anything to pass and actually become law. And so sending a really strong response and making sure to the House, when the House is revealing what they want to do, and making sure your U.S. senators know about it, is important. It sends a message that this is something people are watching. And things that don't get much of a response, probably the Senate will assume people support those cuts, or at least they don't object to them enough to do anything about them. We've kind of been in this holding pattern for a few months now, thanks to all of your work, where we've been in this moment of waiting. And even though there's been a lot of activity happening, right, we haven't really been in the process at a point where the process is moving forward. That is now changing. This process is going to move faster now than it has in the last 3 months. Remember, the House has a real incentive to kind of reveal these cuts and then move them quickly through a bill and pass it. Because the quicker they move, the less opportunity there is to change what the cuts that the committees have proposed. So that means we have to move faster as well. We have to understand what the cuts are, know how they impact us, and turn around and say, hey, these are things that I do or don't like. And it's kind of like we're in the next 2 to 3 weeks, we're going to be in a constant cycle where we are on a bicycle and we just have to keep pedaling. That is the moment we're in now. Because every time there's an opportunity, we need to take it. So when a committee announces, here's what our ideas are, that's time to make sure the committee knows what you think of their ideas, because that committee is going to have to vote on it. And then the committee has to pass it to another committee, and that committee has to vote on it. And then it goes to the full House. And all of those steps are opportunities for advocates to engage with Congress and let them know what they think. Our goal now is to slow things down again, because when things slow down, it's because people have heard what we have said and it's giving them pause. So this is our opportunity to really say, this is an impact that we don't like. And you have choices, and those choices can be different than what is in your proposal right now. Okay. There still continue to be rumors about a separate bill. That bill has not been introduced to my knowledge. So there's some question now of whether some of the ideas that might have been included in a rescissions bill, some of the cuts that say the non-governmental agency DOGE has has made to various agencies, like staffing cuts and grant programs and other things, whether those cuts will be included as part of the reconciliation bill instead of a rescissions bill. I think those are all things that we should be watching for, and we will quickly figure out as the committees release what it is that they propose to do, whether some of the existing impacts that have already happened are just kind of being wrapped into a reconciliation bill, or if there's still some separate legislation out there that will be coming. My sense, based on nothing else but intuition, is that the longer we go from the administration saying, hey, we're going to be proposing a rescissions bill, that was something that they telegraphed a couple weeks ago. The longer that we go without that rescissions bill being introduced, the more likely it is that we would see some of those cuts being wrapped into the reconciliation bill. So again, we're still at the beginning of this process. I feel like we've been saying that since January, but it's still true, mainly from all of your work, right? We're still at the committee level where these committees have to publicly say, here are the cuts we're proposing, and they have to take votes on it. Now we're at the point where not only are your ideas public, but you're going to have to vote on, those ideas and say, yep, this is what we want to do. And that's going to have to happen a couple of times for House members. So there's plenty of process here before we get to a full House vote, and then plenty of pressure that we can put on all of the House, because all of those members are going to ultimately have to vote on the entirety of what is in a reconciliation bill, including cuts to Medicaid. So the executive branch, what's been going on in the federal agencies? There appears to be a little bit of a pattern that's emerging. And we haven't talked about it quite in this way until this week, but I think it's enough of a pattern where you can kind of see multiple different actions are all kind of moving in the same direction. Since January, there have been people from the extra governmental, DOGE is not an agency. It's a group of private citizens that has been essentially invited in by the administration and given free rein over a lot of agencies and has been, given access to data systems and other things. And they have been working since January to identify programs or things that the federal government does that they think can just be cut and gotten rid of. In January, there was a list of words that was leaked out that seemed to be like search terms. Some people have speculated that artificial intelligence has been one of the tools that DOGE has used to identify and label programs or positions that should be cut. And it's a very long list of words, like multiple pages. But disability, disabilities, institutional, institutionalized, inclusive, lots of words that either directly say disability or are words that are terms of art that the disability field often uses when it comes to how they talk about disability programs or grants that many disability entities would apply for from the federal government. Lots of those words were on the list. Then you can see that the Department of Education was kind of the first agency that announced mass layoffs. One of the places that got the most layoffs was the Office of Civil Rights. 50% of their staff, I think, was laid off in that division, and half of what that staff does is casework related to students with disabilities. So that was kind of another sign. It's like, you're looking for words that say disability or talk about things that in terms that disability people use in a different way. And then you're kind of laying off people who directly work on cases of discrimination for students with disabilities. Then we had the Administration for Community Living, which is where all of the aging and disability programs were kind of consolidated together to provide some efficiency, because those populations and the programs that operate on those populations' behalf have a lot in common. Like they are working to address similar challenges. Well, they announced that they were getting rid of that unit and fired half of its staff. Then a couple weeks later, there was a memo leaked that looks like it is eliminating the independent funding for almost every disability and aging advocacy group that there is, including the Board for People with Disabilities and Disability Rights Wisconsin and the Weissman Center and the Long-Term Care Ombudsman for the Board of Aging and Long-Term Care and many others. So that is another part of the pattern where it does look like we are targeting now disability advocacy organizations. The Department of Justice has deprioritized civil rights enforcement for the work that it has traditionally done. And it's done a lot of work on voting discrimination, including specifically barriers to voters with disabilities. It's done a lot of work on housing discrimination, and it does a lot of work on various kinds of enforcement for the Rehab Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. this last week, there was also a shift on what should that agency do, and it was a shift away from what it has traditionally done. We'll talk about that in a little bit, as well as some changes in the State Department on what they want to report on when it comes to how other countries are handling human rights. So together, there seems to be a pattern where disability things that are connected to disability seem to be consistently being looked at either for cuts or elimination or de-emphasized in terms of what the government does. And I think that we're in a place where this is now a pattern. And it's a pattern that's a little familiar. As we're talking, this is also in the context of big cuts to lots of programs that are important specifically to people with disabilities, not only them, but when we're talking about big cuts to Medicaid, that really does impact people with disabilities more than some other populations, because that's where a lot of people can get the care that they need. We've also talked about changes in Social Security administration. That's another program that lots of people with disabilities rely on. So it isn't only, the things that we just saw in that timeline, it's also various, administrative and also ideas that would reduce funding for programs that have traditionally been very helpful supports for people with disabilities. We are also seeing a big decrease in and cuts to programs that are on the prevention end of side of things, a number of lead poisoning prevention programs, lots of cuts to mental health and substance abuse. Fall prevention is one of the ideas that or one of the programs that's being proposed to be eliminated. Nothing's happened yet, but it does give you a real theme about okay, we're actively trying to cut the programs that are helpful to these populations. There are also programs that we're saying we should eliminate that are helpful in preventing people from either acquiring disability or becoming more disabled. Then there's also a proposal to eliminate the independent voices that really watch out for these, who know these populations the best and kind of look out for them. The people who are thinking, how do we make things better? How do we make sure that the voices of actual people with disabilities are being heard? That lived experience is an important piece. That's a third thing that's happening. And I think that there's a pattern that is becoming more and more evident, that when you eliminate those things, people with disabilities become more isolated. They become more disconnected. And frankly, if something bad happens, they're no longer seen because the people who are watching are no longer there to watch. So all of that is to say, I think there are some reasons that a number of disability and aging advocates are getting pretty nervous that the kind of dismantling of some of the things that have been put in place for very good reason may lead to more risk for these populations. And that it is a sign that there is less willingness to invest and make sure these kinds of people are okay, and maybe more of an acceptance when things don't work out well, that should be a norm, that we should consider that normal when it hasn't been before. Just so folks know, we've covered the Department of Education. Now we're starting to see the results of those cuts to the Office of Civil Rights staff. There are now starting to be reports of a lot of people who need help who can't get it, that they have serious things that are happening in their schools where there's active discrimination for students with disabilities, and there's no one there to help. And there was a recent article with NPR that flat out said that there have been loss of so many staff that it is now pretty hard to resolve a complaint. And by the time you're complaining to the U.S. Department of Education, it's because nothing else has worked at the state level. So these are cases that there really is no one else to resolve except for at the federal level. And now that there's too many cases for too few staff, and that means that there are people who need help who really can't get any resolution to it. The U.S. Department of Justice Office of Civil Rights that has received a memo that really shifts its work to enforcing priorities that have been outlined in the president's executive orders. So, the article that we will share after the webinar really shows that there's a very direct shift away from enforcement of voting rights, of enforcement of housing discrimination, the direction to the disability section of this department has nothing to do with disability. So it's really a question mark for what kind of cases will the Office of Civil Rights be taking, and if they're taking those cases, are they not going to be taking much of the routine work that has traditionally and historically been very helpful to people with disabilities? The State Department is similarly changing what it wants to know about in its international human rights reports. Just to note, one of the items that is no longer going to be included is whether a country has violence or threats of violence targeting people with disabilities. That has been a metric that has been consistent over many, many years to kind of figure out whether a country is doing a good or not so good job on treating its people well. That's one of the markers, and that is something that the State Department is no longer going to be including in its report for the first time, among many, many markers. Then the Department of Health and Human Services Secretary has made a series of comments over the last week. Last week, we talked about the press conference that the secretary had, in which he made a number of very specific comments about people with autism, really from a deficit standpoint, where he made a broad statement that people with autism wouldn't be able to be taxpayers or work or go on a date or write poems and a number of other things. He walked that statement back slightly a couple days later, mainly because a lot of people with autism and families of people with autism got very angry and said, well, none of those things are true for the people that I know. And even if they are true for some people with autism, we shouldn't be measuring people with autism in those metrics. Like, people with autism have inherent value and the right to exist and the right to full and meaningful lives, regardless of whether or not they write a poem or are paying taxes, right? So there was a slight movement back from his original statement, but not that far back. The comments he made on April 18th, he refocused the same set of comments to a more narrow group of people with autism, specifically talking about nonverbal people with autism. And then he went on to say that to continue to say that autism is a preventable disease, and make some assessments that the occurrence is because of some exposure to something, and went as far to say that people with that we should have a compensation fund for families who have a person with autism in the family. That's important because compensation funds are really about one-time payments to victims that have suffered irreparable harm. They've been used for crime victims or victims of, environmental exposure or other things. They haven't been talked about as a mechanism to help families who need consistent support over time. And certainly the research community has been united in responding to some of the ideas that the secretary has said about the causes of autism and the needs to, to provide continuing support for people as opposed to one-time payment. But again, these are all things that have been said kind of in the last week. Again, it's part of a pattern, and I think we should hear it in a very specific way. Even when somebody changes what they revise what their comments were, I think it's important to hear what they first said. Because when they start changing the language, they're changing it because they're getting a response that that is telling them what they said isn't very popular. So they're trying to revise the language to get it to a point where more people will accept or agree with that language. And I think that in this case, it's what is being said here, walking it back a little bit is really not enough. And I think there are a number of disability advocates that are very concerned this might be an actual strategy, that perhaps what was said the first time is what really best reflects what the secretary's ideas and the position, and that as they're revising, it's really trying to figure out where is the agreement point where maybe the majority of the public, a lot of whom may not necessarily engage with a certain population of people, including people with autism, where do they agree that those people have less value, right? And once you get to a place where there is a small group of people that folks think of as being it's okay to treat them differently, it generally works out that that population of people that you think it's okay to treat differently expands. And I think in this case, what the secretary is saying is really very clearly defining who should we value less, and that has a bunch of policy implications, right? Who are the people who are so damaged that there's nothing that you can do, and they don't meet the ways that we establish value, tax paying, et cetera. And it's not that far a bridge from those people cost a lot. And we're in a cost cutting mode. Who is the group that we can decide is worth less time or less resources? And for people with disabilities and older adults, I think that's really dangerous. Certainly there were some other comments after that, April 20th, that I think kind of underscore that idea. Literally, many of us remember COVID. When you're comparing the rate of autism as to being more impactful than a pandemic that killed 1 million people in this country, many of them older adults, that's a pretty strong statement. And it also tells me that maybe older adults might be in the same boat in terms of who's being valued. Certainly some of the similar organizations under the Administration for Community Living do a lot of work for older adults, and we're all aging. So eventually we'll all become a part of that older adult community. So I think it's just worth noting that these things continue to be said and continue to be emphasized. And even when a statement is kind of revised down or polished or softened, I'm not sure it really changes the underlying opinion that's being first expressed. There's also been in the last week, this week actually, on Monday, the National Institutes for Health announced, and there was an article about, hey, we're going to have a new disease registry to track people with autism. NIH is under the Department of Health and Human Services, so it's part of the same agency that's been making a lot of other comments about autism. 2 days later, they changed their language and said, oh no, it's not going to be an actual registry. It's going to be a, quote, real world data platform. You can assess whether that's different substantively. I don't know. It's different words. And that they would be spending $50 billion on research. Again, the secretary has said, well, we're going to figure out the cause of autism by this September. And in that original press conference, referenced several things that independent researchers have said for decades are actually not causal for autism. So things like vaccines, things like insufficient parenting, mostly from mothers, those kinds of ideas were all things that the secretary talked about when he was announcing we're going to research and find the cause of autism by September. They're spending money on this. And certainly a lot of people reacted very strongly after the announcement on Monday, so strongly that they changed what they were saying. I think there's a lesson for us to be learned on this. Again, people responding and calling out and asking questions and being very questioning what has been said does make a difference. The idea that they are changing their language is a response to the outcry that they have heard in 2 days. So it's a lesson for us as we think about not only budget reconciliation, but some of these other proposals at federal agencies that are going to be impactful to people with disabilities. It's always worth your time to ask questions, to say no, to say this doesn't match my experience, and to push back on things. Because when members of the disability community have pushed back, they have stepped back. And it shows us that we kind of need to maintain that vigilance probably over a long period of time to keep making it clear that we're watching and that we are seeing and not necessarily liking some of what we're seeing. The other piece that's going on at multiple federal agencies is, again, a movement to delay or stop payments. So again, this is part of the non-governmental agency DOGE happening, where they appear to have put in some manual requirements that are really impacting not only the flow of funding to states and higher education institutions, but now actually, nonprofits and anyone else who is submitting reimbursements that need to be approved. That includes things that have had funding that is approved from Congress, including disability organizations. So just another layer of something to watch. If you are willing to not actually open the spigots to let money out, that does become a problem for entities that require a source of money to keep operating or require reimbursements for work that's already been done. We talked a little bit about the funding uncertainty for a lot of aging and disability organizations. This has been developing since last Thursday, and we've kind of continued to learn a little bit, but not a lot more. A lot of these groups have very specific roles that are related to people with disabilities directly and older adults. And the roles that they have are really to push systems and programs to work better for people, to be more efficient and effective, create new approaches. They're to listen to people with disabilities and kind of, take that lived experience into the work of how do people actually experience these what are the real challenges in people's lives, and how do we think about addressing those challenges. They're also the people that you call when things are going really, really wrong, right? So when you suspect that there is abuse or neglect, or somebody isn't respecting a person with disabilities' rights, they're these people too. So all of these programs have a unique role, and they've been in place as a network for a long time because there's been recognition that people with disabilities and older adults do need an extra layer of eyes that are watching out specifically for their interests, because these groups often have additional barriers and challenges that aren't necessarily the systems that we have created think about first. Obviously, you can contact your member of Congress about lots of things, but I do think this is an important thing to talk about. Lots of you may have experience with this organization or others that have been very helpful to you at times in your past. And if these particular advocacy voices are eliminated, they won't be recreated somewhere else. So the idea of, when you get rid of the people who are watching, what does that mean for the future, is an important one to consider. And there's certainly lots and lots of experiences that people with disabilities have now that are probably unknown to lawmakers, that are things that advocates talk about all the time to try and affect change. But without advocates, you become independent voices unto yourself, experiencing these things, and in a lot of ways it gets harder to change the underlying causes. The Department of Education, last week we talked about the states all being asked to sign a certification that let people know, or let the Department of Education know, that they are not doing any quote illegal DEI practices within schools. 18 states, including Wisconsin, said, hey, we already are in compliance with all of our federal laws. So we're really unclear about what you want us to certify, because we believe that we are in compliance with not only federal law, but subsequent court cases that have, been related to discrimination. And Wisconsin said, we're not going to sign a certification that we don't know how it's going to be used, and we're not quite clear about what we're being asked to certify. We were among 2 states that asked a bunch of questions to the U.S. Department of Education. Wisconsin did not receive a reply for any of those questions. Many states kind of feel like that certification request was a precursor for you signed this thing, and we U.S. Department of Education are now going to use that as a way to prohibit certain kinds of federal money coming into your state if we think that you've signed the certification and that you aren't actually in compliance. So 18 states, and you can see them here, are saying, no, we're not signing this. Other states have either already signed or are still reviewing. The deadline for signature, I believe, was yesterday. So maybe this map has changed. It's really unclear how the U.S. Department of Education is intending to use that certification, or what they will do to states who are not going to sign it at this time. I guess that's something we will continue to watch. So what should we be thinking about doing in the next couple of weeks? We've talked about how there's going to be a lot of stuff happening, at least with the House, as committees reveal their cut ideas, as people learn what they are and respond maybe to more than one committee. The other strategy that I think is useful at this point, lots of people have said, hey, I've had a meeting with my U.S. congressman, but it was a while ago, and they haven't offered me another meeting when I've asked, or I've been calling and emailing, but I haven't really gotten a lot of response. You should still call, you should still email, but you should also send a handwritten letter and a picture to your U.S. senator and your congressional representative. Letters are something, it's old school, but it is very personal. And many of the cuts that are being proposed are going to impact you personally. So for a lot of U.S. offices in D.C., the mail is something they can't ignore. Somebody actually has to open those letters and read them. and your face in their that's a way to get your face in their office, even if they don't agree to meet with you. And it's overall helpful to legislators because it is more tangible and real. And sometimes they use those stories when they're making debates in a committee or speeches on the floor. So it's a strategy that I think we haven't tried before in mass, but it's, I think, useful to kind of give some real physical weight to the number of people who are watching and trying to influence what's going on. You don't have to do it all in one letter. You can send multiple letters. Yeah, you can send a card. You know, it doesn't have to be long. A lot of people have been touched by Medicaid or other programs that impact people with disabilities in many, many ways. And it's okay to write 300 words on each way and keep your letters flowing. The idea is that these offices are always getting mail, and it's always coming from people with disabilities who are talking about very real personal things that have been helpful to them and that they think should be continued because they'll help somebody else. Okay, so you don't have to, this is not a novel. It's like you're writing testimony for your joint finance hearings that are coming up. 300 words that really powerfully says, here's how Medicaid has touched me. Here's how this particular thing that special education does matters. Here's how a disability program has helped me. Those are the important things that that we need to keep going in waves to the legislature. And it's also another way that you can get together with other people. If you want to have a letter writing party, it doesn't have to be in person, it could be virtual. That's a great way to sit and talk with other people who share similar experiences and trade stories and maybe get some ideas on how to make your story stronger. It could be something that you do every week just to kind of keep tabs on yourself and make sure that there are letters flowing. And as we move through this time, I think that knowing that you are part of a lot of people who are doing the same things is helpful and important. So May is going to be really active. I haven't talked about this at all, but the last two Joint Finance Committee hearings are Monday and Tuesday of next week, and we'll go through a little bit of that. So again, another opportunity to talk at a statewide forum that's being recorded by Wisconsin Eye. You know that the press is going to be there. You know that lawmakers are going to be there. Great opportunity to talk about Medicaid and special education and all of the things that help people with disabilities be a part of their communities and live meaningful lives. We've talked about a lot of need for reacting to what the House is doing over the next couple of weeks. There's always the opportunity to keep doing what you're doing, which is posting and sharing and connecting with people in your life that are not disability related to let them know how these cuts are impactful. We've talked about a lot of engagement directly with the congressional offices, but it's also important to keep that engagement and those posts up in your social network so that other people understand that what these cuts actually mean to people that they know in their lives. Lots of people have been writing op-eds. There was a person who posted, they got their op-ed about autism published in the New York Times this week. So that's always a great thing to do. Writing your letters, make sure that at this moment, you are letting people in your life know what is being proposed in Congress and what it means to people with disabilities and other groups. There's still a lot of folks in the greater public who really are not tracking what Congress is doing as closely as you are. And so you can be a trusted information source that helps them understand what is happening and whether or not they like what's happening. The Wisconsin Medicaid Coalition is also planning some community conversations, and I think there will be some, again, listening sessions that various lawmakers will be doing in May, maybe specifically about Medicaid. We're trying to focus at the Medicaid Coalition on some populations of people that haven't been as covered, unpaid caregivers, as well as mental health populations. So, you know, if there's an event in your area that you know about, it's always worth your while to go and to those events and be vocal at them. A lot will be happening. There's going to be a lot of ways to participate in May, and they're all going to be important. So just briefly, the state budget hearings, we're at the last two, Monday and Tuesday. So it's important to, you know, add your voice to that process. Monday is going to be in Hayward, and Tuesday is going to be in Wausau. You can see that they've tried to hold the hearings in different parts of the state, so people who live in those parts of the state can get there more easily. I think that the state lawmakers who are writing the budget heard a lot about special education and Medicaid in their first two hearings. And they are very well aware that the stuff at the federal level, stuff meaning all sorts of cuts to many kinds of money that comes into the state, but especially Medicaid, are going to be really impactful to the state budget. It's also important for people to kind of ask their state lawmakers. You know, we still kind of get this message that they haven't necessarily been able to get a hold of their members of Congress, or maybe they haven't tried very hard, or maybe they're trying to separate, you know, their role as a state lawmaker from a federal lawmaker. But I think it is important to say, like, at the federal level, there are things happening that will impact Wisconsin, and you have a greater role to the state of Wisconsin to make sure that harm doesn't come to us. And if that is communicating directly with the members of the congressional delegation, it's certainly time to do that. For those of you who are able to go, here's some tips on how to attend a hearing. Sometimes the committee always decides kind of the rules for the day. I heard that they were giving people 2 minutes to speak at the first two hearings. Other years that's been 3 minutes to speak. Doesn't matter. You guys are really professional at this point. You can say important things in a few sentences, whether it's 2 or 3 minutes. It is a worthwhile thing to get there early, to go with the group, to make a day of it and talk to other legislators and their staff and their media while they're there. You know, people are often waiting. There's often a kind of a camaraderie that is at these events because everybody's waiting together. And then you get to testify. And lots of people sometimes take video of others as they're testifying to post. We know that the hearings are always recorded. Lots of times media will take little snippets of people and include that in their stories. So there's a lot of reasons where you can get not only good coverage for yourself, but it can create coverage of the issues that you care about beyond the event itself. And that's certainly what happened in the first two hearings. So here's our last opportunity, but an important opportunity to have that happen next week. Just some ideas of things that that you might talk about at hearings. Lots of people use the opportunity to talk about Medicaid. I think that's still really a worthwhile message for lawmakers to hear. They can't really hear about that enough. And special education. And there are other priorities that people with disabilities raised as well. Again, this is what those hearings are about. They're about listening to actual real people talk about what they think the state budget should focus on. If you can't attend a hearing, you can still participate, and we've given you some tips here. If you submit a public comment to the Joint Finance Committee, also make sure that your state senator and your state representative get that comment. And again, record your story and post it online, because we want to make sure that the public comments that are submitted to the committee actually go farther than just the committee. So I'm about to conclude. We are in a moment where all of the work that you have already done has really mattered. And now we're being asked to step on the gas. And I know you guys have already been doing so much things over so many months. And now we're finally at the point where it's go time. And it really is up to individual people at this point. Thank goodness you're so well practiced, right? That you have been doing this for many of you for various ways for your whole life. So I think you should take a lot of credit for where we are now. And I think that every gain that we get from this point forward will be entirely due to the work that you're about to put in. You have a lot of advocacy experience, you have lived experience, you have expertise and content knowledge that lawmakers do not have. That gives you credibility. You're persevering and you're patient because all of you have been repeating yourself for years over time, saying the same things to different people. And it does matter. It may feel like it doesn't, but it does. Lots of people are not being very vocal at this moment. That is not true of you. And that means that you are even more important than you realize. You're going to be heard, or you're just going to keep talking. And there's no reason to not keep talking until there is something that is final. Remember, until the bill is signed into law, things can be changed. And until changes are made at federal agencies that there's always the opportunity to stop them. What we have seen is that when people push, then the administration and Congress steps back and changes. The important piece is to keep pushing. And I think we're in a position where we're going to push really hard for 3 weeks and it's going to matter. And you can't see it now, but it is going to matter. It's already mattered. Because again, we were supposed to have $880 billion of Medicaid cuts just happen by the end of February. And we're not going to get through the first part of the process until the end of May. So with that, I'm going to stop and take any questions. You will get the slides and the recording in your email this afternoon.
I'm just looking. I don't think there's any questions. If you're raising your hand and you have a question, please put it in the Q&A and I will ask Tammy. There was one question about, is the oh my gosh, what is that bill called? Rescission bill similar to a reconciliation, because it needs that simple majority.
It is similar. It is a different name, right?
Yeah.
And it's the administration asking Congress to do certain things. And they can ask Congress to codify, basically say it's okay to make cuts that have already happened, or take back money that's already been appropriated, or make changes that could affect future spending. And that person is correct. It only takes a simple majority. So you can pass a rescissions bill with 50 senators as opposed to 67. Yeah. That bill has not been, to my knowledge, proposed by the administration yet.
Okay. I think that was it. Wait, I'm just looking. There's a question. Can you explain more about the stories to the general press? I'm not really sure what that means. I think, you know, a lot of what we're doing is helping people get their messaging out, or people are getting their messaging out in the press. So, not quite sure what that means. But all of the information regarding press is in the packet that you will get. So you'll have all that information to be able to look at that. Oh, about the op-ed. Yeah, so all of that will be in the packet, and you'll get the recording and the packet. But otherwise, I think we're good to go. All right, that's it.